"Don't open that door. I saw her face." Rosalie heard it through the wood. Every word. She stood on the Halverson porch with both palms pressed flat against the door she had just knocked on, and she did not move. She heard the floorboards shift inside. She heard a man clear his throat. She heard a child ask something, and a woman hush it sharply. And then silence. The kind of silence that was its own answer. She was 29 years old. This was the 41st door. If this story speaks to something you have carried, please subscribe to this channel right now and follow Rosalie all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far her story travels. Now stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. She did not knock again. That was the part nobody ever saw the moment after. The moment when a woman who had already swallowed more rejection than most people faced in a lifetime had to decide in the cold on a stranger's porch whether to knock again or walk away. Rosalie Everhart had learned across 41 doors, and 18 months of trying that knocking again never changed anything. It only gave the people inside more time to rehearse their excuses. So she turned around. She walked back down the Halverson porch steps with her spine straight and her chin level and her cloth bag shifting on her shoulder, and she did not look back at the door, and she did not cry. She had made a decision a long time ago, before the Graysons, before the Sutherlands, before Mrs. Pratt in Billings, who had said to her face that she couldn't have someone with that kind of marking working near her children. She had decided that she would not spend her tears on rooms that were not worth them. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother, who had raised her alone and worked herself to exhaustion in other people's kitchens, and never once told Rosalie to cover her face or apologize for it, had told her two things that Rosalie carried like tools in a belt. The first was, walk out of rooms that don't deserve you with your spine straight, because dignity is the one thing no door can take from you. The second was, when everything closes, stand still for a minute. Don't run. Don't rage. Ask yourself what you believe about the next hour, standing at the bottom of the Halverson steps. In the November wind, Rosalie asked herself that question. What she believed about the next hour was this: she had $4 left. She had her mother's recipe notebook tucked inside her coat against her chest. She had 7 years of experience managing working kitchens that could feed dozens of hard men through a Montana winter. And 2 weeks ago she had walked past a notice pinned to the post outside Miller's General Store in Mill Haven that she had not yet answered. Blackthorn Ridge Ranch. Cook and household manager needed. Inquire within. She had walked past it 6 times. She had not gone in because she was tired. Not physically. She had endured physical exhaustion her whole life, and it was not the thing that wore her down. She was tired of the moment. The moment of walking through a door and watching someone's face rearrange itself. She had watched it so many times she could name every stage of it. The openness, first hopeful, expectant, a little relieved that someone had finally come about the position. Then the eyes dropping just slightly to the left side of her face. Then the stillness, like a pond after a stone. Then the slow draining of welcome water, finding a crack in the floor, disappearing without drama. And then the search, the rapid, desperate search behind polite eyes for a reason that was not the real reason. She was tired of watching that search. But $4 and a Montana November were their own kind of argument. She walked into Millhaven. Carl Briggs was behind the counter of the general store when she pushed through the door, and she watched his face do the thing and did not react to it. And she came to the counter and looked him in the eye. "The Blackthorn Ridge notice," she said. "Is it still standing?" Carl Briggs blinked. "It is. Whitlock was in just yesterday asking if anyone had come about it. And had anyone, he had the grace to look at the counter. No one who suited. I'd like to ride out and speak with him today." Carl set down his pencil. "Miss Everhart." His voice had the tone of a man who believed he was protecting her from something. "Whitlock runs a hard operation. 12-men rough bunch, and the ranch itself is in a difficult—" "I'm not asking for your opinion on my suitability, Mr. Briggs," Rosalie said. "I'm asking whether there's a wagon heading that direction today that I might ride." A pause. "Ed Marsh is taking supplies out past Blackthorn Ridge this afternoon," Carl said. Leaves from the livery at 2. Thank you, she said, and turned for the door. Miss Everhart. His voice came after her, and she stopped, but did not turn. I mean no harm. It's only folks out that way, they're not always— I know what folks are like, she said. And she opened the door and walked out into the cold. Ed Marsh was a man in his 60s who smelled of pipe tobacco and horse, and who had the excellent quality of not asking questions. He looked at her when she climbed up beside him on the wagon seat. Looked at her face with the brief, settled assessment of a man old enough to have stopped being surprised by what the world contained, handed her a wool blanket without comment, and clicked his horse into motion. She was grateful for his silence. She used it to think. She knew things about Blackthorn Ridge, the way you knew things in small towns in pieces, through conversations that stopped when they noticed you listening. The owner, Caleb Whitlock, was a widower. He was quiet in a way people called cold, though Rosalie had learned that quiet and cold were not the same thing, and people who couldn't tell the difference usually hadn't sat with enough silence to know what lived inside it. He'd had 3 cooks in 8 months. The ranch was struggling. The hands had stayed loyal through hard times. That last piece was the one that interested her most. Men didn't stay loyal through hardship for a cold man. They stayed for something else. She didn't know what it was yet, but it was there. Blackthorn Ridge came up on the right side of the trail just as the light was beginning to thin and go cold. She took it in through the wagon's movement, the main house solid and plainly built, the fencing mostly intact, but repaired in places quickly rather than well. The outbuildings with the particular lean of structures maintained out of necessity. It was not a dying ranch. There was a difference between struggling and dying, and she had seen enough of both to know which she was looking at. The bones were good. This is as far as I go your direction, Ed Marsh said, pulling the wagon to a slow stop at the gate. This is where I'm going, she said. She handed back the blanket and climbed down. Thank you, Mr. Marsh. He tipped his hat. He drove on. She stood at the gate and looked at the property for exactly as long as she needed to, which was about 10 seconds. Then she opened the gate and walked up. A ranch hand broke away from the group working near the barn and came toward her with the easy, watchful gait of a man who was responsible for knowing who came onto his employer's land. He was young, maybe 25, with a direct way of looking that she appreciated. "Help you, ma'am?" he said. He looked at her face. He did not flinch. She noted it. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Whitlock about the cook position," she said. "Is he available?" "I'll check," he said. "You can wait on the porch." She went to the porch. She waited. The cold settled around her, and she let it standing still with her bag at her side and her notebook inside her coat, watching the last light work itself out of the western sky. Footsteps. She turned. Caleb Whitlock was not what she expected, though she couldn't have named exactly what she'd expected. He was tall in the way that came from work, rather than inheritance. Lean and substantial, both with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had been weathered into its final form. Not handsome in a practiced way, but something more honest than that. A face that had made its decisions and lived with them. He was not wearing his hat. Men on the frontier almost always wore their hats when they came to the door. The fact that he hadn't meant he'd moved quickly without thinking, which meant the hand's report had caught his attention in a way that made ceremony feel unnecessary. He looked at her. Not at the left side of her face. At her, the whole of her, the cloth bag, the notebook-shaped outline beneath her coat. The cold she was standing in the way. A man looks at a situation he is trying to understand. "You're here about the cook position," he said. His voice was quiet and deliberate, the kind that didn't spend itself on extra words. "I am," she said. Rosalie Everhart. 7 years managing working kitchens. 4 references in writing, available to start immediately. How many men are you feeding? Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. Something more like recognition. The look of a man who'd been told the answer to a question he'd nearly stopped believing had one. 12, he said. "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." He did not interview her on the porch. He did not make her stand at the kitchen door. He brought her inside into the main room, and she followed him and looked at the space around her, the way she always looked at a new place, cataloging, assessing, measuring what was there against what should be. The kitchen was visible from the doorway. She looked at it immediately, and what she saw made her go still for a half-second in a way she controlled before it showed. The shelving was nearly empty. Not sparse. Nearly empty. A quarter of what a kitchen feeding 12 working men through a Montana winter should hold. She noted the broken cabinet hinge, the warped floorboard in front of the stove, the cracked pan hanging on the back hook. She noted all of it in the time it took Caleb Whitlock to set a coffee pot on the stove and turned to see what she was looking at. He saw her looking at the kitchen. She said, "How bad is it?" He said, "Bad enough." "Show me." He walked to the kitchen, and she followed, and he opened every cabinet without comment one by one, and she looked at what was inside them and made her assessments in silence, and when he closed the last one, he stepped back and looked at her. "The flour is critical," she said. "Whatever's left won't last a week at working rations. Salt is nearly as bad. That cracked pan needs to go before someone is burned. The floorboard in front of the stove needs to be fixed for the same reason." She paused. "What's your current supply arrangement?" "No real arrangement since March," he said. "The last cook ran orders through Miller's. When she left, the accounts were muddled. I've been doing it as I go." "That doesn't work for 12 men in winter," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't." He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on the work table near her without making a ceremony of it. She picked it up. "I had 3 cooks this year," he said, plainly without apology. First one left because the work was harder than she expected. Second one had family trouble, which was legitimate. Third one, I had to let go because she was charging double on the supply orders and keeping the difference. Rosalie set her cup down. "How much? $40 over 4 months. And the account at Miller's. Still open. Carl's agreed to release it on good faith if the kitchen shows it's being managed properly." She looked at him. "Mr. Whitlock, I need you to understand something before we go further. If I take this position, I will manage your kitchen accounts with complete accuracy. I will show you every figure, every order, every discrepancy. But I need to know that whatever debt came before me is understood as coming before me. I will not walk into another person's mess and be held responsible for it." He looked at her steadily. "That's fair," he said. "Then I have one condition." He waited. "The kitchen runs my way," she said. "I report to you on accounts and supply. I work within whatever budget you set, and your priorities for the ranch are my priorities for the kitchen. But inside that room, the decisions are mine. If a man has a complaint about the food, he brings it to me directly and respectfully, and I'll hear it. If he comes through that door with his attitude preceding him, I send it back the same way." The silence lasted exactly long enough. "That's fair too," Caleb said. He extended his hand. She shook it. And that was how Rosalie Everhart came to Blackthorn Ridge Ranch on a cold evening in November 1886, with 12 men she hadn't met, and a kitchen that looked like it had survived a small war and lost. She started the next morning before anyone else was awake. She had asked Caleb for a full inventory before she slept, and he'd given her a handwritten list with question marks beside 3 items, because he wasn't sure what was still usable. She had appreciated the honesty more than she'd said. She lay in the small room off the kitchen, cold but private, which was all she needed, and ran calculations in her head the way she always did in a new place, mapping the problem in the dark, building the shape of the solution before she ever picked up a pan. By the time the sky was beginning to lighten, she had a fire in the stove, water heating, and a clear picture of the first week. The first breakfast she made at Blackthorn Ridge was not impressive. There wasn't enough to make impressive with. Cornmeal mush with dried apples stirred through for the sweetness that kept men from complaining about the rest. Biscuits plain because she was conserving flour. Salt pork fried crisp because that was the right way to serve what she had. Strong coffee because strong coffee was the one thing that could redeem a modest meal in the mind of a working man. She rang the bell. At the same time, she always rang it 15 minutes before the men were supposed to start. The first one through the door was Hank Deering. She knew his type before he said a word. Large man, not unkind-faced, but built like someone accustomed to having his assessments respected. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went from the food to her face, and she watched the sequence move through him. Surprise, discomfort, the solidifying of skepticism, and he said, "You're the new cook." "I am," she said. "Coffee's hot. You're welcome to eat standing or sitting." He sat. The others came in behind him. They all did the same thing. Looked at the food, looked at her face, looked at each other, and she moved around the table, filling cups, and kept her face neutral and her pace even, and gave them nothing to interpret except competence. A young man near the end of the table, thin, quick-eyed Georgia in his accent, tasted the mush and said, "The dried apple's a good touch." "Thank you," she said. "Ain't seen dried apple in this kitchen in 3 months," he said. "Found half a jar in the root cellar," she said. "Still good." Hank Deering looked up from his plate. "You went through the root cellar already?" "This morning," she said, "before the bell." "There was light enough," she said, which was technically true if you counted a lantern. Hank put his fork down and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he picked it up and finished his breakfast without another word. She counted that as a beginning, the full inventory. She did that first day, revealed what she had suspected, and worse. Supplies stored incorrectly and spoiling. Critical items at dangerous levels. A barrel of molasses near the root cellar door, where the freeze-thaw was beginning to crystallize at another month, and it would be nearly unusable. She moved it herself, relocated it to the south corner of the root cellar, where the insulation was better, and said nothing to anyone about having done it. When Caleb came to the kitchen at midday, she was ready for him. "This is what we need before end of week," she said, and handed him the list. "Starred items are critical. Flour especially Thursday, and not a day later." He looked at the list. "I can make Millhaven by Thursday." "Good." She paused. "Also, the molasses barrel was deteriorating near the door. I moved it this morning to the south corner. You should know in case you were tracking its location." He looked at her. "I wasn't," he said. "But I should have been." He folded the list. "Ed Marsh told me he'd brought a woman out from town yesterday. Said she had a recipe notebook and a look like someone who knew what she was doing." "Ed Marsh is a perceptive man," she said. Something almost like a smile moved through Caleb's expression. He went out. She stood in the kitchen after he left and listened to the sounds of the ranch around her, the men working the wind, beginning to move the particular creak of the main house, settling in the cold, and felt quietly, and without allowing herself too much of it. Yet the possibility that this was a place she could stay. The complications arrived in the second week, which was exactly when she expected them. Hank Deering had not stopped. He was too experienced for open hostility. He understood that a cook hired by the boss was not a target. A smart man walked toward directly. Instead, he did the thing that Rosalie had learned to recognize as more corrosive than confrontation. Steady quiet. Plausible skepticism, delivered with the tone of a reasonable man, simply asking reasonable questions. "Ma'am." He caught her one evening as she was coming in from the root cellar with her arms full. "These biscuits, they're different from what we had before, denser. Men are noticing." "Men are eating," she said, and kept walking. He followed her to the kitchen door. "I ain't saying they're bad, only that the previous cook had a certain way with the recipe, and the men were accustomed. Mr. Deering." She set the supplies on the work table and turned to face him. "The previous cook's recipe produced biscuits that fell apart before they reached a man's mouth in the cold. I've seen the records. I know what she was spending to make those biscuits. I can make you soft biscuits that dissolve like smoke if you'd prefer, but you'll run through your flour supply in 3 weeks and be eating flat bread by December. Is that the preference you're expressing?" Hank Deering looked at her. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "Good," she said. "Then I'll keep making them the way I make them." He went out. She turned back to the work table and let out a slow breath and adjusted nothing. But she could feel the balance. The men still watching, still deciding, still weighing whether the woman behind the birthmark was someone they could trust or someone they were enduring. She knew how that balance tipped. She had tipped it before. It did not tip through arguments, and it did not tip through softening herself, and it did not tip through trying to make them like her. It tipped through one thing only, which was undeniable quality delivered without asking for anyone's approval. On the morning of the 9th day, she made a pie. Dried cherry, because that was what she had, and she knew dried cherries better than most women knew their own names. She made the crust the way her mother had taught her, cold lard minimum handling the exact right resting time. And she made the filling with brown sugar and cinnamon and patience, letting it cook low and slow, so the cherries held their shape and didn't surrender into sweetness. She baked it in the afternoon and set it on the work table to cool while she made the evening meal, and the smell of it moved through the main house and out into the yard, the way smells do on cold afternoons when there's nothing between you and the air. Every man on the ranch was at the table before the coffee finished pouring. She served supper first. Beef and root vegetable stew over cornbread. Said nothing about the pie. The men ate, and the silence had the quality of attention. They knew something was coming. They could smell it, but they didn't ask because asking would have given something away. Then she brought the pie. She set it in the center of the table and began cutting without ceremony, and the silence shifted from the silence of men eating to the silence of men paying a different kind of attention entirely. Hank Deering received the first slice. He was deliberate about it. He cut a careful piece with his fork and lifted it and put it in his mouth and chewed, and his face said absolutely nothing for what felt like a long time. Then, to no one in particular, in the voice of a man making a private reckoning with a fact he had not expected to encounter, he said, "That's a damn good pie." He did not look at Rosalie. The young man from Georgia Thomas, she'd learned whose grandmother was the woman he measured every cook against, looked directly at her and said, "Ma'am, that's the best pie I've had since I left home." "I appreciate that, Thomas," she said. The balance tipped. Not all at once. She was too experienced to believe one pie changed everything. But it changed enough. Men who had not said thank you began saying it. A hand named Cutter, who had dropped a coffee cup on her first morning without apologizing. Apologized one evening at supper without context or explanation, as if the apology had been working its way out of him for days and had finally found the door. Hank Deering said nothing more about recipes. She was careful not to let herself feel too settled. She knew what happened to women who mistook a warming for a welcome. She kept doing the work. She kept the accounts clean. She kept the kitchen running with the precision of a woman who understood that competence was the only argument that could not be taken from her. The mistake came in the third week. She had placed the first complete supply order through Miller's and checked the figures 3 times, but she had written the potato quantity in her mother's shorthand. A private notation system she had used so long, she had stopped thinking of it as anything other than obvious, and what she had meant as 12 pounds had been read as 20. When the supplies arrived and she was unpacking them, she found the extra 8 pounds and stood over them for a moment with the specific sinking feeling of a mistake that belonged entirely to her. She went directly to Caleb's study. She knocked. She went in. He was at his desk with the ranch accounts open, and he looked up. "I made an error in the potato order," she said. She did not sit. She had not been invited to, and she was not going to arrange herself in comfort to deliver a failure. "My notation was misread at Miller's. We have 8 extra pounds I didn't budget for. I've already worked out how to use them before they turn twice. Baked a potato bread, a thick soup running 2 nights with different additions. It won't cost anything additional in the long run. But the variety this week will be constrained, and I wanted you to know directly, rather than have you find it in the accounts." He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Walk me through the adjusted menus." She did. He listened. "All right," he said. "That works." She turned to go. "Miss Everhart." She stopped. "A mistake doesn't decide who you are," he said. "What you do after it does." She stood in the doorway with that sentence moving through her, and she did not speak immediately because the words had landed somewhere deeper than she had expected, and she needed a moment before anything she said would come out right. He had not said it with pity. He had not said it with patience the way a man speaks to a woman he is managing. He had said it the way you say a thing you actually believe plainly without decoration, because the truth doesn't need any. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll have the menus written before morning." She went back to this kitchen and stood at the work table with her notebook open and her pencil in her hand, and she did not immediately start writing. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel the size of what had just happened, which was not a conversation about potatoes. Nobody had said that to her before. In 18 months of doors and 41 rejections and rooms that found 100 reasons to look away from her face, Not one person had said anything to her about what a mistake did or didn't decide. They had simply let the mistake or the face or the birthmark or the fear decide everything without discussion, without appeal. She started writing. The menus came easily because she already knew them. The fire in the stove worked steadily at her left side. Outside, the wind had picked up the way it did some Montana nights coming down off the ridge with a low, deliberate sound. She could hear the men in the bunkhouse murmurs and occasional laughter, the ordinary sounds of a working place settling into its evening. And somewhere in the writing between the twice-baked potatoes and the second night's variation on the soup, she became aware that she had not asked herself in 3 weeks what she would do if this door closed. She had not asked because she had been too busy working to remember she was supposed to be afraid. She looked at the shelf above the work table, the empty shelf she had looked at on her first morning and decided she would fill. Her mother's notebook could sit there propped where she could see it while she worked. A small jar of the dried herbs she always kept separate. The tin with the cinnamon she'd brought from her bag. A personal preference, a small luxury one that no position she'd ever held had been able to take from her because no one had ever thought to look for it. She was going to fill that shelf. She was going to stay. The decision settled in her chest, with the weight of something solid, not heavy, but real. The way certain things are real when you've waited for them long enough to stop expecting them. She was not a woman anyone had wanted. She had understood that for a long time. She had walked through it and kept walking and done her work and carried her mother's voice and her mother's notebook and her own hard-won understanding of kitchens and accounts and the particular geography of human prejudice. She was still here. The wind moved over Blackthorn Ridge, and the stove held its small, steady warmth, and Rosalie Everhart finished writing her menus and set her pencil down and looked at the empty shelf and thought tomorrow. Tomorrow she would fill it. And for the first time in longer than she could name, tomorrow felt like something she was walking toward and not something she was bracing for. The shelf was full by the end of the 4th week. Rosalie had not made a ceremony of it. One morning she had set her mother's notebook against the wall at the back, propped so the spine faced out and she could read the faded lettering while she worked. The herb jar went beside it. The cinnamon tin beside that. 3 small things arranged without comment, and she had turned back to the stove and started the morning meal and said nothing to anyone about what it meant. But Caleb had seen it. He came into the kitchen that morning for the supply list she had prepared, and he stopped for a half-second at the work table when he noticed the shelf, and he did not say anything. But something in the quality of his silence told her he understood that the shelf meant she intended to stay. He took the supply list and went out, and she heard him tell Thomas in the yard to be sure the root cellar latch was fixed before nightfall, because the cook needed reliable access in the mornings. It was not a grand gesture. It was a practical one. She understood that it was also something more. She had been at Blackthorn Ridge for 28 days. In those 28 days, she had reduced the weekly kitchen waste by nearly a third, restructured the supply orders so that nothing critical ran low without 3 days' warning, and produced meals consistent enough that the men had stopped talking about the food, the way men talk about food when they are unhappy with it, constantly, inventively, with the specific creativity that hunger and frustration produce together. They had started eating the way men eat when they trust what's in front of them, which was quickly and without comment, which was the highest compliment a working kitchen could receive. She had also started noticing things about the ranch that were not her business, and that she noticed anyway. The accounts, for instance. She had access to the kitchen accounts, that was the arrangement, but the kitchen accounts touched the ranch accounts at certain points, specifically where supply costs intersected with the ranch's overall operating budget. And when she did her reconciliation at the end of the 3rd week, she found a number that did not sit right with her. Not wrong exactly. Not in the way that the previous cook's numbers had been wrong with the particular fingerprints of deliberate manipulation. Wrong in the way that a number is wrong when someone is paying more than they should be for something they haven't looked at closely in a long time. The feed account. Blackthorn Ridge was paying 40 cents more per hundredweight for its grain supply than the current market rate. She knew the current rate because she tracked commodity prices the way her mother had taught her, not because she expected to need them, but because information was always cheaper than ignorance. She had not said anything yet. The feed account was not her account. But 40 cents on every hundredweight added up across a full season of feeding cattle, and the number in the kitchen reconciliation that touched it was large enough to make her pause. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning when Hank Deering came through the kitchen door with a look on his face that she recognized immediately as the look of a man who had decided to say something and was going to say it, whether the timing was right or not. "Ma'am," he said, "I need a word." She was at the stove. She did not stop what she was doing. "Go ahead, Mr. Deering." "It's about the men," he said. He pulled out the chair at the end of the work table and sat in it without being invited, which she noted. "They're talking." "Men generally do," she said. "About you." He paused. "About or about the situation." She set her spoon down and turned to look at him directly. "Say what you mean, Mr. Deering. I don't have the patience for the long way around." He looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something in his face that was not skepticism and not discomfort, but something more complicated than either. Something almost like difficulty. Like a man trying to say a thing he did not know how to say without it coming out wrong. "There are men on this crew," he said, "who won't be here come spring if Whitlock can't show the bank he's operating at a profit. 3 of them got families. I've known some of these men 8 years. I was here when this ranch was running clean before everything went sideways." He stopped. "What I'm saying is, I need to know if you're the real thing. Not a question about your face, not a question about your size. I'm past all that. I need to know if you're the kind of woman who stays when it gets hard, or if we're going to be starting over again come January." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. "What happened to the ranch after his wife died?" she said. Hank was quiet. "I'm not asking out of curiosity," she said. "I'm asking because the supply accounts have a hole in them that predates the cook who stole from him, and I need to understand the full shape of the problem if I'm going to be useful to it." Hank Deering put both hands flat on the work table. "Mrs. Whitlock handled the accounts, all of them. Caleb ran the cattle and she ran the books. When she passed, he tried to keep it going himself, but he's a cattleman, not a bookkeeper, and the people he hired to help saw that. Miller at the general store renegotiated the supply rates while Caleb was still in the first months of grieving. I don't think Caleb noticed until it was too late to argue without looking like he was blaming a man who'd done him nothing but favors." Rosalie turned back to the stove. She was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did she die?" 3 years, Hank said. "And he's been paying the inflated rates since then." "I reckon so." A pause. "You noticed?" "I noticed," she said. "I haven't said anything yet because it's not my account." "You're going to say something?" "Yes," she said. "I am." Hank Deering was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said quietly in the voice of a man who has revised his opinion and is not entirely comfortable admitting it. "All right, Miss Everhart. I reckon you're the real thing." "I know I am," she said. "But I appreciate you saying so." He stood and pushed the chair back in with the care of a man who had not intended to be here as long as he was. He was almost to the door when he stopped. "The men who've been giving you the hardest time," he said without turning around. "It wasn't about your face, not all of it. They had a cook 2 years back who came in confident and left when the first hard winter hit. Left in the middle of the month, middle of the week, middle of a cold snap. Men went 2 days on biscuits and dried jerky because there was nobody to run the kitchen." He paused. "That's what they're afraid of." She heard the door close behind him. She stood at the stove and let that settle, and then she put it somewhere practical, which was the only place she had ever known how to put things that were too large to carry around all day and too important to set down for good. She went to Caleb that evening. She knocked on the door of his study, and he said, "Come in," and she came in, and did not sit down, and did not arrange herself. Just stood on the working side of his desk and said, "The feed account. You're paying 40 cents over market per hundredweight on the grain supply. I need to know if that's a negotiated arrangement, or if someone took advantage of a difficult period." Caleb went very still. "How do you know that?" he said. "The kitchen accounts touch the feed budget at the seasonal intersection," she said. "I ran the reconciliation. The rate you're paying is the November 1883 rate. The current rate is 40 cents lower per hundredweight." He was quiet for what felt like a long time. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger at her. "I signed that arrangement in January 1884, he said. 4 months after Eleanor died. I wasn't reading closely." "I know," she said. "I'm not telling you this to cause you distress. I'm telling you because it's your money, and you deserve to have the full picture of it." She paused. "If you want me to calculate the full amount overpaid across the 3 years, I can do that tonight. And I can draft a letter to the supplier requesting a renegotiation to current market rate. You don't have to send it, but it should exist." Caleb looked at her across the desk. "You went outside this kitchen account to find this," he said. "The kitchen account is connected to it," she said. "I follow the numbers where they go. That's how I work. If that's a problem, tell me now." "It's not a problem," he said. His voice was quiet, and something in it had shifted. "Draft the letter." She drafted it that night at the work table after the men were in the bunkhouse and the ranch was quiet. She wrote it in the clear, direct language she used for all business correspondence. No apology in the tone, no hedging. Just the facts, and the request, and the reasonable expectation that a man of business would understand the market had moved. She left it on the kitchen work table with a note that said, "For your review," and went to sleep. It was the day after she left that letter that Victor Halston first came to Blackthorn Ridge. She did not know who he was when she saw him. She was in the yard between the kitchen and the root cellar. When the wagon came up the road, an expensive wagon, the kind that said money. Without shouting, it pulled by a matched pair that had not been bred for work, but for appearance. The man who climbed down from it was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, and wore his hat at the angle of a man who knew he was being observed and did not mind. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now carried the particular authority of a man who had been agreed with too many times for too long. He looked at the ranch. He looked at the outbuildings. He looked at the main house. Then he looked at Rosalie. His expression did not do the thing that most expressions did. He did not flinch or recalibrate. He simply looked at her the way you look at something that is in a place you did not expect to find it, and his eyes were assessing in a way that had nothing to do with her face and everything to do with her presence, what she was doing here, whether she was significant, whether she was an obstacle. "Is Whitlock in?" he said. "I'll check," Rosalie said. "Who should I say is calling?" "Victor Halston," he said. "He knows me." She went to the main house and knocked on the study door and said, "Man named Victor Halston is in the yard asking for you." The quality of silence from the other side of the door told her something. It lasted a half-second too long. "Tell him I'll be out directly," Caleb said. She delivered the message and went back to the kitchen and did not appear to be listening, which meant she heard everything that the wind carried through the kitchen window, which in a yard without many obstructions was more than Victor Halston would have preferred. "Caleb." Halston's voice was warm and wide, the voice of a man who used warmth the way some men used a fence to establish the perimeter of a space he controlled. "You're looking thin. Ranch life'll do that." "Victor." Caleb's voice was its usual economy. "What brings you out?" "Neighborly visit," Halston said. "Heard you'd hired on some new help. Wanted to see how things were coming along." A pause. "The cattle prices are going to drop hard this spring. I've been talking to 3 other operators in the county. We think it makes sense to consolidate before the market forces the issue." "You've said that before," Caleb said, "and I'll keep saying it until it makes sense to you," Halston said, and the warmth in his voice did not change, which was the most informative thing about it. Warmth that doesn't shift when it meets resistance is not warmth, it's strategy. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the Blackthorn Ridge acreage, better than what you'd get if you waited for the bank to start asking questions." "The bank isn't asking questions," Caleb said. "Not yet," Halston said pleasantly. "But they will become spring audit if the operation numbers don't improve. I'm trying to save you the indignity of that conversation, Caleb. We've known each other a long time." Rosalie set her ladle down on the work table very carefully and stood still. "I appreciate the concern," Caleb said in the tone of a man who did not appreciate it at all. "The ranch isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price," Halston said. "Think it over. The offer doesn't stay open indefinitely." Another pause later, almost casual. "Who's the woman?" My cook, Caleb said. Interesting choice, Halston said. And she could hear in those two words exactly what he meant by them, which was not a question about her qualifications. She heard Caleb's voice come back immediately flat and final. She's the best cook this ranch has had in 3 years. I'd appreciate you remembering that. The silence that followed was short. Of course, Halston said with his warm, managed smile audible in every syllable. My compliments. I'll see myself out. She heard the wagon leave. She stood at the work table for a long moment after the sound of hooves faded, and she thought about what she had just heard. And what she had just heard was this: a man who wanted this land and was patient about wanting it, which was the most dangerous kind of wanting there was. Thomas came into the kitchen for an afternoon cup of coffee and found her standing very still with her hands on the work table, and he looked at her with his quick eyes and said, "You heard that, didn't you?" "I heard some of it," she said. "Halston's been trying to buy this land for 2 years, Thomas said, dropping his voice the way young men drop their voices when they are saying something true. He bought the Ketterman property east of here last year, paid under value because Ketterman was behind on his banknote, and Halston knew it before Ketterman did. Rosalie looked at him. How did Halston know before Ketterman? Thomas looked at the coffee in his cup. Nobody knows for certain, but Halston's friendly with the bank manager in Millhaven. Real friendly. The kind of friendly where one man always seems to have information the other man shouldn't have shared. She was quiet for a moment. Does Mr. Whitlock know this? I reckon he suspects, Thomas said. But suspecting and knowing are different, and Caleb ain't the kind of man to accuse without proof. No, she said. He isn't. She refilled Thomas's cup, and he went out, and she turned back to the stove and began the preparations for the evening meal. And while her hands worked through the familiar motions, her mind was working through something else entirely, the shape of what she was beginning to understand, which was larger and more deliberate than a supply rate or a kitchen account or a neighborly visit. Victor Halston was not waiting for this ranch to fail. He was arranging it. She did not say this to Caleb that evening because she did not have enough of it yet to say. She had suspicion, and she had pattern, and she had the particular clarity that comes from having spent a lifetime watching people decide who was worth looking at and who wasn't, which meant she had a well-trained eye for the difference between a man acting on opportunity and a man creating it. What she needed was the proof. And proof in her experience almost always lived in the numbers. She went back to the accounts that night. Not the kitchen accounts this time, but the full picture she could reconstruct from the supply records, the seasonal orders, the cost per unit figures across the last 3 years. She sat at the work table after the ranch was quiet, and she built the picture line by line, the way her mother had taught her to build anything from the ground up, with patience, without skipping steps, because you thought you already knew what you were going to find. What she found made her sit back and look at the wall. The feed account renegotiation was not the only one. The timber supply for fencing repairs inflated. The cost of the veterinary arrangement for the cattle above the county standard rate by a margin that required an explanation she had not been given. And the grain supplier whose name appeared on the invoices was not. She realized when she looked at it carefully, a supplier she had found any record of in Millhaven or the surrounding settlements. She wrote down the name. She folded the paper and put it in her notebook. She went to sleep late and was up before the sky lightened. The day she confronted Caleb with the full picture was also the day Hank Deering told her without being asked something she had not expected him to say. She had given Caleb the reconstructed accounts at midday, not dramatically, not with announcement, just set them on the desk in front of him with a quiet, "I think you should look at this when you have time," and started to go. He had looked at the first page and said, "Sit down." And she had sat, and they had gone through it together line by line in the particular silence of two people who are looking at something bad and are being honest about it. "The grain supplier," she said, pointing to the name. "I can't find them in any directory I have access to. That name should be verifiable." Caleb looked at the name for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "That's Halston's brother-in-law's company. He set up a supply company 3 years ago." The silence in the room was total. "Caleb," she said. And it was the first time she had used his first name, and neither of them made note of it, because the moment was too serious for that kind of accounting. This is not a coincidence. No, he said, it's not. You've been paying above market to a company that feeds money back to the man trying to buy your land at below market value, she said. He's been making the ranch look worse than it is on paper while using your own money to do it. Caleb stood up from his desk and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she gave him a moment because a man needed a moment with something like this. How long? He said finally. From what I can reconstruct, at least 2 years, she said. Possibly closer to 2.5. He was quiet for a long time. If I'd had someone watching the accounts, he said. Not to her, not to anyone in the room, just the sentence sitting in the air with all of its weight. You have someone watching them now, she said. He turned around. She met his eyes and did not look away, and what was in his expression was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated than gratitude. The look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time, and has just discovered unexpectedly that he is not carrying it alone anymore. What do I do with this? He said. First, you cancel the arrangement with that supplier and document the cancellation, she said. Second, you write to the county land office and request a copy of all recorded transactions in this area for the past 3 years, which is public record and which you are entitled to. Third, she paused. Third, you might want to speak with a lawyer, preferably one who doesn't share a church pew with Victor Halston. Something happened in Caleb's face that she had not seen there before. It was not a smile quite, but it was in the neighborhood of one, a brief, complicated expression that acknowledged the absurdity and the seriousness of a situation. Simultaneously, the expression of a man who had just been reminded that intelligence could be funny even when the circumstances were not. There's a lawyer in Helena, he said. Came through last fall for the county land disputes. Solid man. Write to him this week, she said. I will. He looked at her. Miss Everhart Rosalie. And it was the first time he had used her given name, and again, neither of them made note of it. I brought you in to run the kitchen. You did, she said. Ed, you're doing considerably more than that. The kitchen is connected to everything else, she said. That's how kitchens work. You can't separate the food from the finances from the function of the place. I follow the numbers where they go. I told you that at the beginning. You did, he said. And then after a pause that was not long, but that carried something in it, I'm glad you followed them here. She stood up. She straightened her apron. She said, I'll have supper on the table at 6, and she walked back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and let the heat of it settle around her, and did not let herself think too long about the way he had said her name. She did not let herself think too long about it, because she had learned a long time ago the cost of attaching hope to things that were not yet certain. She had learned it the way most women learned it, through experience, through the specific arithmetic of caring about a situation that did not know it was being cared about. Caleb Whitlock was a man she respected. A man who had treated her with a directness that felt, compared to most of her experience, almost like radical decency. A man whose face did not do the thing. But respect and directness and the absence of flinching were not the same as the rest of it. She made supper. She rang the bell. The men came in, and Hank Deering, who had said nothing personal to her since the morning he told her she was the real thing, stopped in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. Actually, in his hands, not on his head, which was a gesture she had not yet seen from him, and said, Ma'am, the men wanted me to say something. She was at the stove. She turned. Go ahead, she said. We know you've been doing more than cooking, he said. We don't know the details, and it ain't our business to know. But a ranch talks, and we can feel when something's shifted. He turned his hat once in his hands, a slow rotation, the gesture of a man choosing words, the way he chose tools carefully because the wrong one would make the job worse. What I'm trying to say is, we see you working, and we want you to know that you've got more friends in this yard than you probably think you do. Rosalie looked at Hank Deering. She thought about 41 doors. She thought about a woman's voice through wood. She thought about 18 months of cloth bags and recipe notebooks and $4 and the particular exhaustion of being looked at before being seen. I appreciate that, Mr. Deering, she said. And her voice came out steady, which was the best she could do because the alternative was something she had promised herself a long time ago. She would not spend in rooms that were not worth it. This room was worth it. She turned back to the stove. "Supper in 10 minutes, she said. "Tell the men to wash up." She heard him go. She heard the sounds of the yard outside, and the men moving toward the bunkhouse, and the particular creak of the main house that she had learned to read. The way you learn to read any structure you live inside, long enough, its complaints and its solidness, and the sounds it made when it was simply settling into itself. She stood at the stove and stirred the pot, and thought about Victor Halston's matched pair of horses, and the warmth in his voice that did not shift when it met resistance. And she thought about a grain supplier whose company fed money back to a man who was dismantling a ranch from the outside, while it looked like the ranch was simply failing on its own. And she thought, not this one, not this kitchen, not this ranch, not these men, not this man who came to the door without his hat and said her name like it was simply her name, and told her a mistake did not decide who she was. Not on her watch. She stirred the pot and made the supper, and said nothing to anyone about what she had decided, because the kind of decision she had just made did not require an announcement. It only required the work, and the work she had always known how to do. The letter from the Helena lawyer arrived on a Thursday morning, and Caleb read it twice at the kitchen table, while Rosalie refilled his coffee without being asked, and said nothing, because she had learned that Caleb Whitlock processed important information, the way he processed everything quietly, completely, without narrating the process. When he set the letter down, he said, he found the company registration. She waited. Halston's brother-in-law registered the grain supply company in November 1883, Caleb said, 6 weeks after Eleanor died. He said it without inflection, but the muscles in his jaw did something that told her what the inflection would have been if he had allowed it. He filed the first invoice to Blackthorn Ridge in January 1884. Same month I signed the feed rate arrangement. The kitchen was very quiet. He was watching, Rosalie said. Before she was even gone a month he was watching. Yes, Caleb said. She turned back to the stove because he needed a moment, and because she needed one too, and they took their separate moments in the same room, which was something she had noticed they had gotten good at without discussing it. What does the lawyer recommend? She said. He says we have grounds for a civil claim, Caleb said. But he says the stronger move is to take the documentation to the county land office and the bank simultaneously. If Halston's connection to the bank manager is what Thomas believes it is, putting the evidence in front of both of them at the same time closes the back channel before Halston can use it. When can you go to Helena? End of the week, he said. I want to take you with me. She turned around. You built the case, he said, simply, without elaboration in the way he said things that he meant completely. You should be there when it's presented. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. End of the week. He picked up his coffee cup. He picked up the letter. He went back to his study. And Rosalie stood at the stove and thought about a man who had watched a woman's hands before he looked at her face, and what that meant, and deliberately did not think about it for too long. She had made herself a rule about that. The trouble came before the end of the week. It came on a Wednesday, in the form of a woman named Doris Calloway, who was the wife of the largest dry goods merchant in Mill Haven, and who arrived at Blackthorn Ridge in a buggy, driven by her hired man, with the particular purposefulness of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say, and was determined to say it before she lost her nerve. Rosalie was in the yard when the buggy arrived, returning from the root cellar, with her arms full, and Doris Calloway stepped down from the buggy and looked at her, and then looked away, and then looked back with the expression of a woman doing something she had been talked into and was not entirely comfortable with. I need to speak with Mr. Whitlock, she said. I'll let him know you're here, Rosalie said. Can I ask what it concerns? Doris Calloway's eyes moved to the wine-colored mark on Rosalie's face, and then away again in the rapid, practiced way of someone who had been in the presence of Rosalie's face before and had developed a method for managing their reaction to it. It concerns ranch business, she said. Personal ranch business. Rosalie set her supplies on the porch and went to get Caleb. She did not listen at the window this time. She went back to the kitchen and stayed there and let whatever was happening in the front room happen without her, because there were things that were her business and things that were not, and she had learned to tell the difference, even when it was uncomfortable to stay on the right side of the line. She heard voices. She heard Doris Calloway's voice rise once, and then come back down. She heard Caleb's voice steady and even throughout. She heard the front door open and close, and the buggy leave. Caleb came into the kitchen 10 minutes later. "Sit down," she said without turning from the stove. "I'll pour." She heard him pull out the chair. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across the work table. His face was doing something careful and controlled that told her the conversation had been more significant than a neighborly visit from a merchant's wife. "Halston's been talking," Caleb said. She waited. "Doris Calloway came to warn me," he said. "She's not a bad woman. She doesn't have a great deal of spine, but she's not bad. She said Halston has been making the rounds of the town merchants, telling people that the ranch is in financial trouble, which is not entirely untrue on the surface, and that the reason it hasn't recovered is the management." He paused. "He's been telling people that a woman who looks the way you look, is driving customers and business partners away from Blackthorn Ridge. That serious men won't do business with a ranch that puts you at the front of its operations." Rosalie held her coffee cup with both hands and said nothing. "He's been saying it in the kind of places where it spreads," Caleb said. "The barber, the church, the bank." He stopped. "Doris said the bank manager repeated it to her husband last week. As a fact. As if it were an established business assessment." The kitchen was very quiet. "He's trying to discredit the ranch before we can get to Helena," Rosalie said. "If the bank manager believes the operation is failing because of poor management, any documentation we present looks like a desperate attempt to redirect blame." "Yes," Caleb said. "How long has he been saying it?" "Doris thinks at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks." Which meant he had started the moment he left Blackthorn Ridge and saw her in the yard. She thought about his eyes on her that afternoon, not flinching, just assessing, calculating whether she was an obstacle. She had her answer now. She was. "We need to move the Helena trip forward," she said. "Not the end of the week. Tomorrow." Caleb looked at her. "That's tight." "I know," she said. "But if he gets to the bank manager before we do, if he puts enough doubt into that conversation, the documentation loses half its force." She looked at him directly. "Can you be ready tomorrow?" "Yes," he said. "Then we go tomorrow." She stood up and went back to the stove and began organizing what needed to be organized, because tomorrow was tomorrow, and tonight there was still supper to make for 12 men and accounts to put in order, and a travel folder to prepare that needed to be clear and complete and impossible to misread. She worked until well past midnight. She heard Caleb's study light go out at some point and then come back on again an hour later, which meant he was doing the same thing she was doing, which was preparing for a confrontation they had not asked for and could not afford to lose. When she finally sat down in her small room off the kitchen and looked at the folder in her hands, every document organized, every figure annotated, every connection between Halston's company and the inflated accounts drawn in lines that a man with no patience for complexity could still follow. In under 10 minutes, she thought about Doris Calloway's eyes moving quickly away from her face and about what it meant that a woman had driven out to a ranch to warn them, even a woman without much spine. And she thought about what that cost Doris and whether Doris had known it would. She thought it probably had cost her something. She thought it mattered. The trip to Helena took most of the next day. Caleb drove. They did not talk constantly, which was something she had come to understand was not absence, but its own kind of presence. Two people who did not fill silence with noise because neither of them was afraid of what silence contained. They talked when there was something worth saying, and did not talk when there wasn't, and the miles went by in the particular rhythm of two people who were, without either of them having made a formal decision about it, beginning to trust each other's company. At some point past the midway mark, Caleb said, "She loved this land." He did not explain who he meant. He did not need to. "How long were you married?" Rosalie said. 11 years, he said. "We came out here in the 4th year when the ranch was just the land and a half-built main house." She used to say the wind out here was the most honest thing she'd ever heard because it didn't pretend to be gentle when it wasn't. Rosalie thought about that. She sounds like someone who knew the difference between honesty and cruelty. "She did," Caleb said. And then after a pause, "She would have liked you." Rosalie did not respond immediately because the sentence required care. It was the most personal thing he had said to her, and it was said in the voice of a man who was not performing, who was simply stating a thing he believed because he had thought about it, and it was true. "That means something to me," she said finally. And it did. More than she was prepared to say out loud on a wagon on a cold road in Montana. They arrived in Helena in the late afternoon and met the lawyer, a compact, precise man named Aldous Reeves, who had the quality of very still water, the kind that was deep rather than shallow, in his office on the main street. Rosalie laid out the documentation on his desk in the order she had organized it and walked him through the sequence without preamble, and he listened with his hands folded and his eyes moving between the pages, and her face with the attentiveness of a man who was recalibrating his expectations mid-presentation. When she finished, he said, "You put this together yourself?" "I did," she said. "From the kitchen accounts, and the supply records, and the seasonal invoices, and the commodity price indices for the county going back 3 years, she said. "The discrepancy pattern is consistent across 34 months. It's not random variation, it's deliberate extraction." Aldous Reeves looked at Caleb. "Where has she been for the past 3 years?" "I've been asking myself that," Caleb said. The lawyer spent an hour with the documents. He asked precise questions, and she answered them precisely, and Caleb answered the questions that were his to answer. And at the end of the hour, Aldous Reeves sat back and said, "This is enough. This is more than enough. The question is, sequence we need to reach the county land office before Halston knows we're here, and we need the bank manager to see this documentation at the same time as the land office, so there's no opportunity for a conversation between them before the evidence is on record." "Can we do that tomorrow morning?" Rosalie said. "If you're prepared to start at 8, Aldous said. "We'll be there at 7:45, she said. They went to a boarding house that night, 2 separate rooms arranged with the straightforward practicality of 2 people who were focused on the morning and not on each other. But at supper in the boarding house dining room over plates of food that Rosalie assessed professionally and found acceptable but not distinguished, Caleb looked at her across the table and said, "You're not afraid." "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not going to let that be the deciding thing." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that how you walked through 41 doors?" She was quiet for a beat. "You heard that." "Thomas mentioned it," he said. "Not as gossip. He said it like it was something he thought I should know." She looked at her plate. 41 doors, she said. 18 months. Every family in the county near enough. She paused. "I kept going because stopping meant agreeing with all of them, and I was not willing to agree with all of them." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The 42nd door was mine." "Yes," she said. "I want you to know," he said, and his voice was the careful, deliberate voice of a man who had thought about what he was going to say before he said it, "that I understand what it cost you to knock on it. After 41. I understand that it was not a small thing." The dining room around them continued its ordinary business. Other people eating other conversations, the sounds of a functioning establishment going about its evening. Rosalie sat inside all of that ordinary sound and looked at Caleb Whitlock and thought that of all the things anyone had ever said to her about the 41 doors, this was the first time anyone had understood that the hardest part was not the rejections. The hardest part was the 42nd knock. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was a woman who dealt in honesty when honesty was warranted, "That is the most precisely right thing anyone has ever said to me about it." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it in the way that mattered. They were at the county land office at 7:45 the next morning. What happened in the following 3 hours was not dramatic in the way that confrontations are dramatic in stories. It was the quieter, more grinding drama of documentation and process and official faces, doing the careful work of understanding what they were looking at. The county land recorder was a thorough man who read every page Rosalie had organized and asked questions in the methodical way of someone building a complete picture before he committed to any of it. The bank manager, reached by Aldous Reeves at the same time in a separate office with a copy of the same documentation, was a different kind of person, the kind who understood immediately what the documents meant and went through 2 distinct stages of expression in rapid succession. the first being careful official neutrality, and the second being the look of a man who realized he had been used and did not enjoy the sensation. Halston's name was in the record by noon. Not as a criminal charge that was a longer process that Aldous Reeves said would take months and possibly longer, depending on what additional evidence emerged from the company registration investigation. But as a notation in the county land records that the transactions affecting Blackthorn Ridge Ranch were under formal review, which meant that any offer to purchase the property was legally complicated until the review concluded, which meant Victor Halston could not move on the land. Not today. Not this week. Not while the review was active. Caleb signed the final document in Aldous Reeves's presence and straightened up from the desk and looked at Rosalie, and she looked back at him, and between them passed something that did not need to be named to be understood. They started back toward Blackthorn Ridge that afternoon. About an hour outside of Helena, Caleb said, "He's not going to take this quietly." "No," she said. "He isn't. He's going to come at the ranch through the one angle he still has," Caleb said. "Which is the town, the social pressure, the talk." "I know," she said. "He's going to make it about your face," Caleb said, and his voice was flat and direct the way he said things that were true and painful and needed to be said anyway. "He's going to use every room in Millhaven to make the argument that the ranch is being mismanaged because of the woman running the kitchen, and he's going to find people who believe it because it's easier to believe than the alternative." Rosalie watched the road. "Let him," she said. Caleb glanced at her. "He already started," she said. "He started 2 weeks ago in the barber and the church and the bank, and we're still here. The ranch is still here. The documentation is on record in the county land office." She paused. "What he says about my face in the next month is going to be the only weapon he has left. And it's the one weapon I have spent 29 years learning how to survive." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "I want to be clear about that," he said. "This is not me protecting you because I think you need protection. You have demonstrated comprehensively that you do not need protection. This is me saying that I will not stand in a room and allow a lie to be spoken about my ranch or the people who work for it without correcting the record. That's a different thing." She thought about that distinction. She thought about all the people in her life who had stepped forward or not stepped forward, and what had motivated the ones who stepped. She thought about the difference between someone who defended her because they felt sorry for her and someone who defended her because they thought the truth mattered. "Yes," she said. "That is a different thing." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and it was the best silence she had sat in for a long time. Victor Halston came to Millhaven on a Saturday. She heard about it from Thomas, who had been in town for supplies, and came back to the ranch at a pace that told her before he opened his mouth that whatever he had seen had not been a small thing. "He called a meeting," Thomas said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. "At the church hall. He told people it was about community standards and the welfare of the settlement." He paused. About 40 people showed up. "Ma'am," he stood up in front of them, and he said that Caleb Whitlock had been taken advantage of by a woman who used her appearance to generate sympathy, and that the real reason the ranch accounts were in disorder was her mismanagement, and that the county land review was he called it a desperate measure cooked up by a grieving widower and a woman who had nowhere else to go. The kitchen was very still. "He said the birthmark," Thomas said quietly. He made it sound like a mark of bad character, like the outside matched the inside." Rosalie turned from the stove. She looked at Thomas. His young face was tight with something between anger and distress, and she could see it had cost him to deliver this, and she wanted him to know she understood that it had cost him. "Was Caleb there?" she said. "No, ma'am. Halston did it on a Saturday morning when he knew Caleb was working the eastern fence line." "Deliberate," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Who was in the room?" she said. What kinds of people? Thomas thought. Merchants, some of the ranch wives. The bank manager was there, stood in the back. The Calloway family. Pastor Wells. He paused. "Mrs. Delaney, the woman whose daughter asked about your face at the Grayson supper." She stood very still. "Did anyone push back?" she said. "Doris Calloway," Thomas said. She stood up and said she'd been to Blackthorn Ridge herself, and the ranch was running cleaner than it had in years, and she didn't think it was Christian to speak about a woman's appearance the way Mr. Halston was speaking. Halston thanked her for her opinion and kept going. A pause. And Pastor Wells asked Halston if he had seen the kitchen accounts personally. Halston said he didn't need to see the accounts, that the evidence was in the ranch's record of difficulty. And Wells. He said that a man who hasn't examined the evidence and is certain of his conclusion is not making an assessment, he's making a decision. And then he sat back down. Rosalie thought about Pastor Wells saying that in a room full of people. She thought about what it cost a pastor in a small town to say something that the room's most powerful man didn't want to hear. "I need to speak with Caleb," she said. "He's still on the fence line," Thomas said. "Then saddle me a horse," she said. Thomas blinked. "Ma'am, I don't wait well," she said. "Saddle me a horse." He saddled her a horse. She found Caleb at the eastern fence with Hank Deering, and 2 other hands replacing a section of post that had gone bad in the freeze. She rode up, and Caleb saw her and the set of her, and he said something to Hank and walked toward her, reading her face the way she had learned. He read everything completely without projection, waiting for the actual information rather than the assumed version. She told him what Thomas had told her. All of it. Without omission and without arrangement, just the facts in the order Thomas had given them. When she finished, Caleb stood very still. "He did it Saturday morning," he said, "while I was out here." "Yes," she said. He looked at the fence post in his hand. He set it down. He looked at her, and she could see the full weight of what he was deciding, and she did not try to make the decision for him or tell him what the right decision was, because she had learned that Caleb Whitlock was a man who arrived at the right decision on his own if you gave him the space to do it. "I'm going to town," he said. "I know," she said. "I want you to come with me." She looked at him. "Are you certain?" "Yes," he said. "He said it about the ranch. He said it about you. The ranch and the people in it are the same thing as far as I'm concerned. I need you there." She thought about 41 doors. She thought about the 42nd knock and what Caleb had said about understanding what it cost. She thought about Doris Calloway standing up in a church hall without enough spine and doing it anyway. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They rode into Millhaven on a Monday morning, which was when the merchants were all open and the street was active and the most people would see them arrive. Caleb had not said anything about the timing, but she understood it was deliberate, because Caleb did not do things without reason. They tied the horses in front of Miller's General Store and walked in, and Carl Briggs looked up from his counter, and his face did something complicated. Caleb said, "I need to speak with everyone who was in the church hall Saturday morning. Can you send word?" Carl Briggs looked at him, then at Rosalie, then back. "I can," he said. "Give me an hour." "I'll be at the church hall," Caleb said. "Tell them it's about the Blackthorn Ridge accounts. In the hour." Rosalie sat in the church hall with the documentation folder on the bench beside her, and did not speak, and did not fidget, and looked at the front wall with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to be still in hostile spaces, because stillness was not defeat, it was preparation. People came in, not 40, perhaps 25. But the bank manager came. Doris Calloway came and sat 2 rows up from Rosalie and turned and gave her a brief tight nod that said more than a speech would have. Pastor Wells came and sat at the front. The Calloway merchant came. 6 or 7 others she recognized from the streets of Millhaven over the past months. Victor Halston came last. He walked in with the ease of a man who believed he controlled the room, and his eyes found Rosalie immediately, and something moved in them. Not surprise, but the recalibration of a man who had expected the battlefield to look different and was adjusting. Caleb stood at the front. "I'll be brief," he said in his quiet, deliberate voice that did not need volume to reach every corner of a room. "Most of you know the Blackthorn Ridge accounts have been in difficulty. Some of you have recently been told why. I want to show you the actual reason." He nodded to Rosalie. She stood and walked to the front and placed the documentation folder on the table that Caleb indicated, and she opened it to the first page, and Caleb began to speak. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not embellish. He did not perform. He presented the figures the way Rosalie had organized them: the supplier, the company registration, the rate discrepancy, the timeline, the connection to the man who had been making offers on the land. He laid it out the way a rancher lays out a fence line post by post. No gaps, nothing decorative, just the structure of the thing standing in the open air where everyone could see it. When he finished, he said, "The county land records are available for anyone who wants to verify what I've shown you. The documentation is on file as of Friday morning in Helena." He paused. "Now, Mr. Halston said something in this room Saturday morning about the woman who manages my kitchen. I'd like to respond to that directly." The room was completely silent. Caleb turned and looked at Rosalie. Not at her face. At her. The whole of her. Then he turned back to the room. "You judged her face before you ever looked at her hands," he said. "Those hands saved this ranch." He paused. "Not because she had nowhere else to go. Because she is the most capable person I have worked alongside in 3 years of trying to hold this place together. She found the fraud in my accounts. She documented it. She organized the legal response. She did all of that while running the best kitchen this ranch has had since my wife was alive." Another pause. "If any of you have a business argument against those facts, I would like to hear it. If you have an argument about her face, I have no interest in it." The silence lasted. Victor Halston said from the back of the room in his warm, managed voice, "Caleb, nobody is questioning the woman's competence. The concern was about appearances, about what the community—" "I know what the concern was about," Caleb said, and his voice did not change in volume, but it changed in something else, something underneath the volume, and every person in the room felt the change. "And I know whose concern it actually was, and what it was actually about." He looked at Halston directly. "The land is not for sale," he said. "It was not for sale before. It is not for sale now. It will not be for sale." He picked up the documentation folder from the table and handed it to Rosalie, and she took it, and they stood there at the front of that church hall in Millhaven, Montana, on a Monday morning in the winter of 1886. And the room looked at them, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Rosalie Everhart felt the weight of being looked at settle into something different. Not discomfort, not judgment, something closer to witness. Doris Calloway said from 2 rows back, in a voice that was not large, but that was steady, I'd like to see those documents, if the offer's still open." "It is," Rosalie said. And she opened the folder, and the room moved toward her, and Victor Halston walked out of the church hall without another word, and the door closed behind him, and nobody turned to watch him go. Nobody talked about Victor Halston walking out of that church hall as if it were a dramatic thing. In Millhaven, people talked about what Doris Calloway did next. She sat with the documentation folder in her lap for 40 minutes and read every page. Her husband sat beside her and read over her shoulder. The bank manager stood at the table for 20 minutes with his hands clasped behind his back and his face doing the careful, controlled work of a man absorbing information that implicated his own judgment. Pastor Wells asked Rosalie 3 specific questions about the accounting methodology and listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man who understood that precision mattered and that he owed it to her to understand what she had actually done before he spoke about it to anyone. When Doris Calloway finally closed the folder, she looked up at Rosalie and said, "I owe you an apology." Rosalie looked at her. "You came to warn us," she said. "Before any of this, you drove out to the ranch when you didn't have to." "That's not enough," Doris said. "I've been in rooms where people said things about you that I didn't correct. Not because I believed them, but because correcting them felt like more than I was willing to do." She paused. "That's a particular kind of cowardice, and I know it." Rosalie thought about 41 doors and the women inside them who had not been cruel, exactly just unwilling. "It takes what it takes," she said. "You got there." Doris looked at her for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and stood up and walked to where Caleb was speaking with the bank manager, and Rosalie heard her say clearly and without hedging, "My husband's store will extend full credit to Blackthorn Ridge for the spring supply orders, whatever terms suit." Caleb looked at her. He said, "I appreciate that, Doris." "Don't appreciate it," she said. "Just use it." The bank manager, his name was Gerald Foss, and he was a man who had spent his professional life carefully positioned between powerful people, waited until the room had thinned before he approached Rosalie directly. He was perhaps 55, precise in his dress, with the eyes of a man who calculated everything and was currently calculating whether what he was about to say would cost him more than not saying it. He said, "Miss Everhart, I want to be honest with you." "I'd welcome that," she said. "Victor Halston has had a relationship with this bank for 15 years, he said. He is a significant depositor and a significant influence on the lending decisions that affect this county." He paused. I repeated what he said about the ranch, about you, in a conversation that I understood to be private, and that was not apparently as private as I believed. "I know," she said. "I want you to know that I have read these documents," he said, "and I intend to review every account connected to Halston's operations with the same scrutiny I should have applied before." Another pause, and he was clearly a man who did not make statements like the next one often, which was perhaps why it came out slightly stiff. "The ranch's loan terms will be reviewed for renegotiation. Given the documented circumstances, I believe a reduction in the interest rate is warranted." Rosalie looked at Gerald Foss. She thought about what it had taken him to say that, not courage exactly, because she did not think he was a courageous man, but the particular kind of motivated honesty that arrives when a person realizes the record they are creating for themselves is not the one they want to be permanent. "I'll tell Mr. Whitlock," she said. "He'll be in touch." Foss nodded and put on his hat and left, and Rosalie stood in the emptying church hall and thought that the world did not change all at once. It changed in the decisions of individual people made one at a time in rooms like this one on mornings like this one, when the cost of the wrong decision became clear enough to make the right one feel possible. She was still thinking about that when Caleb appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They rode back to Blackthorn Ridge in the thin winter light, and halfway home Caleb said, "Foss is going to renegotiate the loan terms." "I know," she said. "He told me." Caleb looked at her. "What did you say to him?" "I said I'd tell you," she said. "He did the rest himself." He was quiet for a moment. "You have a way of creating space for people to make better decisions than they intended to make." She thought about that. "I just don't fill the space with noise," she said. "People will usually get to the right place if you don't crowd them out of it." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the closest she had heard him come to one, and it did something to the quality of the cold afternoon air that she chose not to examine too closely. The ranch was different when they returned. Not different in any way she could have pointed to specifically, but different in the way that a place is different when the people in it have shifted in their understanding of what the place is. Hank Deering was in the yard when they rode in, and he looked at their faces and seemed to read the outcome from whatever he saw there, and he said to Caleb simply, "Good," and went back to what he was doing. Thomas came to the kitchen that evening with a bunch of dried sage he'd found in the supply shed, an old bunch probably left from a previous season, but still good, and set it on the work table without explanation. "Thought you might want it," he said, "for the shelf." She put it on the shelf between the cinnamon tin and the herb jar. It looked right there. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went back to the bunkhouse. She made supper, and the men ate, and the evening moved through its ordinary motions, and it was only when the kitchen was quiet and she was doing the last of the washing up that she allowed herself to sit with the full weight of what the day had been. The church hall. The folder. Doris Calloway reading every page. Gerald Foss and his careful, motivated honesty. Caleb standing at the front of that room and saying the thing he said. Those hands saved this ranch. She had not cried in 41 rejections. She did not cry now. But she sat at the work table for a long moment with her hands flat on the surface, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when something large was moving through her, that she needed to let move without fighting it. She was still sitting there when she heard Caleb's step outside the kitchen door. He knocked. He always knocked before coming into the kitchen after evening, which she had noticed, and which she thought said something essential about who he was. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You all right?" he said. Yes, she said. I'm thinking. About what? She looked at her hands on the work table. About the fact that I've spent 29 years believing that what people thought of my face was the most important fact about any room I walked into, she said. And today in that room it wasn't. It was there. People's eyes did what eyes do. But it wasn't the deciding thing. She paused. That's the first time in my life that's been true in a room full of strangers. Caleb was quiet for a moment. It was true because of what you put on that table, he said. The documents. The work. The 3 weeks of account reconstruction that nobody asked you to do. I know, she said. I'm not saying it was the birthmark that changed their minds. I'm saying I walked into that room expecting to fight both things at once, the evidence and the face, and I only had to fight one of them. That's... She stopped. That's new. He looked at her across the work table, and the kitchen held its quiet warmth around them, and she was aware in the particular way that she had been carefully not being aware of for weeks that the space between them had been slowly changing in character without either of them having done anything deliberate to change it. Rosalie, he said. And he said her name the way he always said it, as though it were simply the right word for the thing he was addressing, uncomplicated, direct. Don't, she said gently. He stopped. Not tonight, she said. Tonight I need to just sit with the day. Whatever else there is, it'll keep till the morning. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, he said. He stood. He pushed the chair back in. Good night. Good night, she said. He went out. She sat in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps cross the main room and go up the stairs, and she sat there until the fire in the stove burned down to coals, and then she banked it and went to her room and slept better than she had slept in months. The investigation into Halston's operations moved slowly, the way legal things moved in 1886, Montana through correspondence and county records, and the patient accumulation of documented fact. Aldous Reeves wrote from Helena twice in the following month, with updates that were encouraging, but careful encouraging, because the county recorder had found 2 additional properties where similar supply arrangements had been made during periods of owner vulnerability. Careful, because Halston had resources and a lawyer of his own, and would not surrender his position without a sustained fight. But the sustained fight was no longer Rosalie's primary occupation. The ranch was. With the loan terms renegotiated and the fraudulent supply arrangement canceled, and the Callaway store's credit extended, the kitchen at Blackthorn Ridge entered its first fully functional season since Eleanor Whitlock had managed the books. Rosalie ordered properly. She maintained the accounts with the precision she had always maintained them. She cooked, and she cooked with something that had not been fully present in her work before, which was the particular ease that comes when a person is not simultaneously defending their right to be in the room they are working in. She had always been competent. She had not always been free. The difference showed in the food, in ways she could feel, but not entirely. Name a looseness in her improvisation. A willingness to try things she would not have risked in a kitchen where she was on trial. A confidence in her judgments that communicated itself to the men eating the results. Hank Deering said one morning in February, "This biscuit is different." She looked at him. "Better," he said, quickly because he had learned. "I mean better." She had modified the recipe 3 days ago. "I added a small amount of rendered bacon fat," she said. "The cold calls for more richness." He ate the rest of his biscuit in silence. Then he said, "You could teach that." She looked at him again. "There are women in town," he said with the careful tone of a man proposing an idea he was not sure would be well received, "who cook for their families all winter with whatever the general store has on hand. They could use what you know, about stretching supplies, about the accounting of it." He paused. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying." She thought about it for the rest of the morning. At midday, she went to Caleb's study and knocked and went in and said, "I want to talk to you about the kitchen." He set down his pen. "Go ahead." "Hank said something this morning that I haven't been able to put down," she said. She told him what Hank had said. "I want to use the kitchen on Saturday mornings for a cooking class. 3 or 4 women at a time, women from town or the nearby ranches who want to learn supply management and winter cooking. Not as a charity, As a skill exchange. She paused. I think it builds something for the ranch. Goodwill in the community. Connections with the women who influence their families' business decisions. And I think it's the right thing to do with what I know. Caleb looked at her for a moment. It's your kitchen, he said. It's your ranch, she said. It's your kitchen, he said again, and this time she understood that he was not being casual about it. He was saying something deliberate about how he understood the arrangement between them, and it was not the arrangement of an employer and an employee that he was describing. She held that understanding quietly. I'll start next Saturday, she said. I'll tell Hank to have the yard clear, he said. The first Saturday 4 women came. Doris Calloway was one of them. She arrived first and tied her horse herself and came into the kitchen with her sleeves already rolled, which Rosalie appreciated. A young ranch wife named Clara Benton came with her hands red from the cold and her eyes quick and eager. A widow named Mrs. Frayne, who had been feeding herself and 2 adult sons on a small homestead, came with a worn notebook and a pencil stub and wrote down everything. And a woman named Pearl, who worked at the Millhaven boarding house, came because Doris had told her to and stayed because she wanted to. Rosalie worked with them for 4 hours. She did not lecture. She showed and she asked questions and she let them make mistakes and corrected the mistakes in a way that did not make the mistake the point of the exercise. She showed them the supply calculation method. Her mother had taught her how to build a week's menu backward from what you had rather than forward from what you wished you had. How to identify the 3 ingredients in any pantry that were doing the most structural work and protect them, how to read a commodity price without being dependent on the merchant's word for what it said. Mrs. Frayne filled 4 pages of her notebook. Clara Benton remade a biscuit 3 times until it came out right, and then held it up with an expression of such uncomplicated triumph that several of the other women laughed, and she laughed with them, which was the sound of something opening. At the end of the 4 hours, Doris Calloway looked around the kitchen and said, "Same time next Saturday." "Same time," Rosalie said. By the 3rd Saturday, there were 8 women. By the 5th, there were 11, and 2 of them had brought daughters. The thing that Hank had called goodwill, and that Rosalie understood as something more structural than goodwill, was building itself in the particular way that real things build, not through announcement, but through accumulation, through one woman telling another woman what she had learned, and that other woman deciding she wanted to learn it too. The kitchen at Blackthorn Ridge became on Saturday mornings a different kind of place than it was on the other 6 days. Noisier, warmer in a human, rather than a stove-generated sense, full of the specific energy of women doing something they had decided was worth doing. Caleb stayed out of the kitchen on Saturdays. This was not something they had discussed. It was something he understood without being told, which was one of the things about him that she had started carefully to let herself value. It was on the 4th Saturday that the second letter arrived from Victor Halston. Not to Caleb, to her. Thomas brought it to the kitchen door during the class and handed it to her with a look that told her it had not come through the regular mail, but had been delivered by a rider, Halston's rider, from the look of the horse Thomas described. She excused herself and went to the room off the kitchen and opened it. The letter was 1 page. It was written in the clear, confident hand of a man who was not making a threat, but was delivering an assessment. It said that the county investigation had turned up a letter written 7 years ago in a different county by a former employer of Rosalie Everhart's, stating that she had been dismissed for financial irregularities in a household account. She read the letter twice. Then she sat down on the edge of her bed and held it in her hands and thought. 7 years ago. She had been 22. She had worked for a family named the Carlyles in a settlement east of Bozeman, and she had been the first to notice that the household accounts were short, and she had told Mr. Carlyle, and Mr. Carlyle had decided that the simplest explanation for a short account was the woman who had brought it to his attention. He had written her a letter of dismissal and a letter of explanation for his own records, and she had left, and she had not fought it because she was 22 and alone. And the kind of proof that would have cleared her was the kind that required resources she did not have. She had not told Caleb about it. Not because she was hiding it, but because it was 7 years ago and she had not thought about it in years, and there was no reason anyone in Millhaven would ever find it. Victor Halston had found it. The letter said, present yourself at the county recorder's office with a full disclosure of your financial history, or this letter will be made available to the bank manager, the county legal review board, and the Millhaven Gazette. She folded the letter. She put it in her notebook. She went back to the kitchen and finished the Saturday class, and did not let anything she was carrying show on her face, because there were 11 women in that kitchen who had come to learn something, and they deserved the full 4 hours she had promised them. When the last woman left, she went directly to Caleb's study. She knocked. She went in. She put the letter on his desk. She said, "Before you read it, I want to tell you the truth about what it contains. All of it. Everything I know." He looked at her face. He did not pick up the letter. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She told him. The Carlyle family, the account discrepancy, her dismissal, the letter she had not fought. She told it plainly without arranging the facts to minimize herself, because the only version of this story she was willing to give him was the complete one. When she finished, the study was quiet. Caleb picked up Halston's letter and read it. He set it down. "Did you take the money?" he said. "No," she said. He nodded once. "Then that's what I know," he said. She looked at him. "Caleb, the letter is documented. It's in Carlyle's handwriting. It says dismissal for financial irregularities. If Halston takes that to the review board, then we take your account books for the past 3 months to the same board," Caleb said. "Every figure, every reconciliation, every supply order, and every invoice. We put your accounting record at Blackthorn Ridge next to a 7-year-old letter from a man who blamed his cook because his accounts were short, and we let those two things stand in the same room and see which one the board believes." She was quiet. "You came to me with the feed account discrepancy," he said. "You came to me with the Halston connection. You drafted the letter to the lawyer. You organized the documentation that's currently under formal county review. A woman who steals from accounts does not build the case that exposes the man stealing from hers." He paused. "Anyone with the capacity to read a balance sheet can see that." She sat with that for a moment. "He's going to send it to the Gazette regardless," she said. "Probably," Caleb said. "The Gazette will print it." "Probably," he said again. "And then we'll respond, and the response will be on record alongside the story. And in 10 years, the only thing anyone in this county will remember about that particular edition of the Gazette is that Victor Halston used it to attack a woman who caught him stealing." He looked at her directly. "Is there anything else in your history that he might find?" "No," she said. "Then we're not afraid of his letter," he said. She looked at him across the desk and thought about what it meant to sit in a room and tell the most vulnerable version of a story, and have the person across from you respond not with reassurance, but with logic, with the specific grounded argument that the truth examined fully was not a liability, but a foundation. She had not known that was possible before Caleb Whitlock. She had believed in the part of herself she kept most private, that the full truth of her history would always be weaponizable by someone with enough motivation to look for it. "Write to Aldous Reeves tonight," she said, because she needed to move into action, or she was going to sit with the feeling in her chest, and it was too large to sit with. "Tell him about the Carlyle letter. He should know before the board does." "Already decided," Caleb said, "and I'm going to write to Carlyle." She looked up. "What?" 7-year-old accusations have a habit of looking different when the accuser is asked to confirm them in writing to a lawyer, Caleb said. "In my experience, men who blame the cook when their accounts are short are not generally men with the courage of their convictions when the cost of the conviction goes up." She stared at him for a moment. "You've thought about this before," she said. "The possibility that someone might look." He met her eyes. "You came here with a cloth bag and a recipe notebook and 7 years of references that every family in the county had already decided not to trust," he said quietly. "I didn't hire you because I thought your history was spotless. I hired you because I watched you look at my kitchen before you looked at me, and I understood what that meant. But yes, I thought about it." The room was very still. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because you hadn't told me," he said. "And it was yours to tell or not tell. I wasn't going to take that from you." He paused. "Has any person in your life ever let you carry your own history without picking it up and holding it over you?" She thought about that for a long time. My mother, she said. And you? He nodded once and picked up his pen and pulled the letter paper toward him, and she understood she was dismissed in the best possible sense, not turned away, but trusted to go do her work while he did his. She stood. At the door she stopped. Caleb, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. And she meant all of it: the kitchen, the first night, the 42nd door, the church hall, the letter tonight, all of the accumulated weight of what thank you was trying to carry. He looked at her across the study and said in his quiet, deliberate voice, "This is your home, Rosalie. You don't thank a person for their own home." She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed through it, the large and complicated thing that was moving through her, and she breathed through it slowly and completely. And when she was done breathing, she opened her notebook to a clean page and began writing the supply order for the following week, because there were 12 men to feed in the morning, and a kitchen to run, and accounts to maintain, and a Saturday class to plan, and this was her home, and she had work to do in it. The Carlisle letter appeared in the Millhaven Gazette 3 weeks later. It ran as a brief item sourced, anonymously, stating that questions had been raised about the financial background of the cook at Blackthorn Ridge Ranch. It ran on page 4. On page 2 of the same edition, there was a letter to the editor signed by 11 women. Doris Calloway's name, first. Clara Benton's second. Mrs. Frayn's third, Pearl's fourth, and 7 others, stating that they had reviewed the kitchen accounts of Blackthorn Ridge Ranch at Miss Rosalie Everhart's own invitation, and that those accounts were the most precise and transparently maintained household records any of them had ever examined, and that the suggestion of financial impropriety was not supported by a single figure in 3 months of documentation, and that the community of Millhaven would benefit from directing its attention toward the documented fraud that was under county legal review, rather than the anonymous character of anonymous sources. Doris Calloway had written it. She had organized the signatures. She had delivered it to the Gazette editor herself the morning before the paper went to print. She had not told Rosalie she was doing it until it was done. When Rosalie found out, she went to find Doris at the dry goods store and stood across the counter from her and said, "You didn't have to do that." Doris Calloway looked at her steadily. "I told you I owed you an apology," she said. "I've been paying it in installments." She paused, and something in her face shifted into the directness of a woman who had decided she was done with the careful version of things. Also, it was the right thing to do. And I have spent too much of my life doing the nearly right thing and telling myself it was close enough. Rosalie looked at Doris Calloway, who had arrived at Blackthorn Ridge without much spine and had been paying the deficit back ever since, and she thought about all the forms that courage took, and how some of them looked nothing like courage until you saw what they were built on top of. "Thank you, Doris," she said. "Don't thank me," Doris said in the exact tone she had used with Caleb in the church hall. "Just keep teaching us how to make those biscuits." Rosalie almost laughed. It was the closest she had come in a long time, and it felt like everything else at Blackthorn Ridge, like something that was going to keep getting easier. The county legal review concluded on a Thursday in late April, and Aldous Reeves sent the findings by courier rather than post, which told Rosalie before she even opened the envelope that the findings were significant enough to warrant the faster delivery. She was in the kitchen when the rider arrived. She signed for the envelope and brought it to Caleb's study, and knocked and went in and set it on his desk without a word. He looked at it. He looked at her. He opened it. He read it twice, which she had learned was how he read things that mattered. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned how to wait for Caleb Whitlock to finish processing a thing before he spoke about it. "Halston's company is dissolved by county order," he said. "The brother-in-law has agreed to a civil settlement that includes restitution to every property owner who paid into the fraudulent supply arrangement. Blackthorn Ridge is listed first because our documentation was the most complete." He paused. "The bank manager has been formally censured and removed from his position on the county lending committee. Gerald Foss keeps his bank, but he loses the committee seat and the influence that came with it." Another pause. "And Victor Halston has withdrawn his offer to purchase any land in this county, permanently, in writing, as a condition of avoiding criminal prosecution." The room was completely quiet. Rosalie sat down without being invited, because her legs had made the decision before her mind caught up with it. She sat in the chair across from his desk and put her hands in her lap and looked at the envelope on the desk and thought about November, about a rider showing up to take supplies past a gate she had stood at for 10 seconds before walking through. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Caleb said. She breathed. She let the full weight of it settle, not the legal outcome that had been building for months and was not a surprise, but the other thing. The thing beneath the legal outcome, which was what it meant for this place, and the people in it, and the woman who had come here with $4 and a recipe notebook and nothing else to recommend her, except the willingness to look at an empty shelf and decide to fill it. "The restitution amount," she said, because even now, even in this moment, her mind went to the numbers. "How much?" Caleb told her. She looked at him. "That's enough to rebuild the eastern fencing properly," she said, "and to winterize the outbuilding we've been losing heat from since January." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did the thing she had heard once briefly in the cold outside Helena. He laughed. A real one, short and full, the laugh of a man who had been handed something he had not expected and who was allowing himself to feel it. "We just won a legal case that took 6 months, he said, "and your first thought is the eastern fencing." "The eastern fencing has been a problem since before I arrived," she said. "It doesn't stop being a problem because we had a good Thursday." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way he had been looking at her more frequently over the past weeks, the way she had been carefully not examining too closely the way that had something in it she did not have a safe name for yet. "Rosalie," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't know what I'm going to say. I know enough of it," she said. "And I still need you to say it, just not yet." She stood. "Let me get supper on the table. Let me tell the men. Let me have tonight be tonight." She paused. "Tomorrow morning." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning." She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and let the heat of it do what it always did, which was bring her back into her body and into the practical world. And she began making supper with the particular focus of a woman who needed her hands occupied so her mind could work. She told the men at supper. She had not planned to. She had thought Caleb would tell them, or that she would let the news move through the ranch the way news moved on a working ranch through whatever channel it found. But she was at the table refilling coffee cups when Hank Deering looked up at her with his reading the room expression and said, "Something happened today." It was not a question. She looked at him. She looked at the table Thomas with his quick eyes Cutter, who had finally learned to say thank you, the men she had fed through a Montana winter, the men whose family's security had been quietly threatened by a man who had decided their ranch was his for the taking. She set the coffee pot down. She told them. The table went through several kinds of silence in the span of about 30 seconds. The silence and absorbing information. The silence of men recalibrating. And then the silence of men who were feeling something they did not entirely have words for, which was the particular relief of a weight that had been present so long they had stopped noticing it until the moment it lifted. Thomas said, "He's gone. Actually gone. Withdrawn from the county in writing," Rosalie said, "as a legal condition." Thomas put both hands flat on the table and looked at them, and she could see something working through him that was not quite joy and not quite grief, but was the complicated thing that arrives when a long strain finally releases. Hank Deering stood up. She looked at him uncertain of what was coming, because Hank Deering standing up unexpectedly was still a variable she had not entirely learned to predict. He extended his hand across the table. She shook it. "You did that," he said. "You know that. Not Whitlock's lawyer, not the county recorder. You. You found it in the numbers, and you didn't let it go." "We did it," she said. "No, ma'am," he said. "We ate the pie. You did the rest." Several men laughed. Even she almost laughed, which was becoming a more frequent possibility at Blackthorn Ridge, and which she had stopped fighting. She slept deeply that night and woke before the sky lightened, which was her habit, and she made the fire in the stove and put the coffee on and stood at the work table, looking at the shelf above it, in the quiet dark, before the ranch came alive around her. Her mother's notebook, the herb jar, the cinnamon tin, the dried sage Thomas had found, The small, smooth stone she had picked up from the path to the root cellar one morning, because the color of it pleased her. A dark gray with a white line running through it like a sentence she could not read. She had not had a shelf in 8 years of working other people's kitchens. Not a shelf that was hers. Not a shelf that meant she was staying. She heard Caleb's step on the stairs at first light, which was also his habit, and she heard him pause outside the kitchen door, and she said without turning, "Coffee's ready." He came in. He poured. He sat at the end of the work table the way he had been sitting there for 5 months, and they were quiet together for a moment, in the particular companionable quiet that had built itself between them without announcement, the way the real things always built. "I thought about what I was going to say all night," he said, "and I've decided to say it plainly because I don't know another way." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "So when I tell you that this ranch has been more alive in the 5 months you've been here than it was in the 3 years before, I need you to understand that I am not speaking about the kitchen accounts, or the supply orders, or the legal case. Though all of those things are true." He paused. "I mean that this place has a feeling in it now that it didn't have. The men work differently. I work differently. I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I think about is what the day is going to be, not what it's going to cost me." He looked at her directly. "I know what I'm describing. I'm not going to use words that are more than you've asked me to use. But I want you to know that I see you, Rosalie. Not the face, and not the birthmark, and not the accounting, and not the cooking, and not any one particular thing. I see the whole of you, and the whole of you is the reason this ranch is still standing." The kitchen held its quiet around them. She had thought about what she would say to this moment in the private part of her mind, where she had been not thinking about it for weeks. She had thought she would be measured. She had thought she would be careful. She had thought she would take the time to construct a response that was appropriate to the size of what she was feeling without being exposed by it. Instead, she said, "You came to the door without your hat." He looked at her. "The first night," she said, "you came out without your hat because you moved quickly without thinking. And I stood on that porch, and I thought this man is going to be someone who moves before he has time to decide how moving will look. And I was right." She paused. "I have been waiting my whole life for a person who moved before they had time to decide how it would look." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said. He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen, and he did not take her hands the way men in stories took women's hands. He simply stood in front of her, the way he stood in front of everything that mattered directly, without distance, with his full attention on the actual thing, and not on how the thing appeared, and she looked up at him, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The spring at Blackthorn Ridge was the best the ranch had seen in 4 years. The restitution money went where Rosalie had said it should go. The eastern fencing rebuilt properly post by post, the way Caleb's father had originally built it. The outbuilding was winterized in preparation for the following season. 3 new calves arrived in March, and all 3 were healthy, which Hank Deering said was the first time that had happened without at least one loss since Eleanor Whitlock had been alive. And he said it without sadness and without superstition, just as a fact he thought was worth noting. The Saturday kitchen classes continued and grew. By June there were 17 women who came regularly. Clara Benton had started bringing her sister. Mrs. Frayne had taught her sons the supply calculation method, and her older son had used it to extend their homestead's food stores through the back half of winter without resupply, which he came to Blackthorn Ridge specifically to tell Rosalie, standing in the kitchen doorway, with his hat in his hands and his face doing the uncomfortable work of a young man expressing gratitude. He was not practiced at expressing. "You changed how we think about it," he said. "Ma used to worry about running out. Now she knows how much she has and how long it lasts. That's a different way to live." Rosalie thought about that for the rest of the day, about the difference between worrying about running out and knowing what you had and how long it lasted. About the specific freedom of knowledge over fear. About how much of her own life she had spent in the first condition, and how different the second one felt. She thought about 41 doors. She thought about them less than she used to. Not because they were gone, they would never be entirely gone. They were part of the structure of who she was, the same way the birthmark was part of the structure of her face, present and real, and not in need of apology. But they occupied less of the available space now because other things occupied the rest of it. The shelf, the Saturday mornings, Hank Deering's handshake, Thomas's dried sage, Caleb saying the whole of you is the reason this ranch is still standing. The whole of you. She had spent 29 years being seen in parts. The face, and then whatever was considered acceptable to notice after the face had been acknowledged and managed. She had never been seen as a whole before Blackthorn Ridge. She had not known what that felt like until she was inside it, and now she could not imagine going back to the partial version, the way you cannot imagine going back to darkness, once you have been standing in full light long enough for your eyes to adjust. The Millhaven Gazette ran a second story in July, not about Rosalie's history, about Blackthorn Ridge Ranch. It was a practical story. The county's agricultural correspondent had come out to write about the ranch's recovery after the fraud investigation, and he had arrived expecting to write about the legal proceedings, and had ended up also writing about the Saturday kitchen classes, about the 17 women who came about the supply management methodology that Mrs. Frayn's son had confirmed had material impact on his family's winter. It was not a sentimental story. The correspondent was not a sentimental man. But it was an accurate one, and accuracy Rosalie had learned was its own form of grace when applied without agenda. The story mentioned her name in the 3rd paragraph. It mentioned her birthmark in the 5th in the context of describing what Victor Halston had said in the church hall and what Caleb had said in response. It quoted Caleb's exact words, "You judged her face before you ever looked at her hands. Those hands saved this ranch." The story ran on page 1. She read it at the work table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee going cold beside her, and she read it twice the way Caleb read things that mattered, and then she set it down and looked at the shelf above the work table. The notebook, the herbs, the cinnamon, the sage, the gray stone with the white line. She had a letter to write. She had been writing it in her head for months. She wrote it now on paper in the clear, deliberate hand she used for business correspondence, and she did not embellish it, and she did not soften it, and she did not ask for anything that she had not already decided she deserved. It was addressed to the Carlyle family. It stated plainly that she was aware of the letter Mr. Carlyle had written 7 years ago regarding her dismissal. It stated that she had never taken money that did not belong to her, and that she had evidence of this in 3 months of meticulously maintained kitchen accounts that had been reviewed by 11 community members and confirmed accurate. It stated that she was not requesting a retraction because she did not need one. She was informing them that the record of her character existed independently of his letter, and that she was satisfied with it. She signed it with her name, her full name in full. She sealed it and set it aside to go out with the mail. Then she made breakfast. Caleb found the letter on the work table later that morning and looked at it and looked at her and said, "Do you want me to read it?" "No," she said. "It's already said what it needs to say." He nodded and put it with the outgoing mail and said nothing more about it, which was exactly right, and she went back to the stove. Hank Deering retired in August. He did not call it retiring. He called it relocating, which meant he was going to live near his daughter's family in Wyoming, a fact that had been in the planning for 2 years and that he had not mentioned to anyone because he was a private man and because he had been waiting. She understood for the ranch to be in a condition where leaving it did not feel like abandonment. He came to the kitchen on his last morning and sat at the end of the work table, where Caleb usually sat, and held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the shelf above the work table for a long moment. "I was wrong about you," he said. "When you came, I want to say that plainly." "You came around," she said. "Not fast enough," he said. "I put you through 2 weeks of testing that you'd already passed before you ever walked through that gate. The business about the biscuits and the recipes and all of it." He shook his head. "I was looking for reasons. Because I'd been disappointed before, and I didn't want to be disappointed again. And I let that turn into something that wasn't fair to you." She looked at him across the work table. "You told me I was the real thing," she said. "And you organized the men. And when it mattered, you were in the right place." "That's generous," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "I don't deal in generous when accurate is available." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything close to a smile from Hank Deering, and it suited his face better than the skepticism had. He stood and put his hat on and paused at the kitchen door. "Caleb's a good man," he said without turning around. "He was a good man before all of this, and he's still one. Whatever's building between the two of you, it's built on the right ground." Another pause. His wife would have said the same. She heard the door close. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment and let Hank Deering's last morning at Blackthorn Ridge settle into the category of things she was going to carry for the rest of her life, not heavily, not as a burden, but as one of the specific, irreplaceable moments that had made her who she was in this place. Victor Halston left the county in September. He did not announce it. He closed the house, dismissed the staff, and departed on a Wednesday morning with 2 wagons and no forwarding address given to anyone in Millhaven. The news moved through the town the way news moved quickly, completely with the particular energy of people processing the departure of a presence that had organized itself around power and left nothing when the power was gone. Thomas brought her the news in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon and stood in the doorway the way he always stood when he had something to tell her, with his hat at his side and his quick eyes watchful for her reaction. "He's gone," Thomas said. She nodded. "You don't look surprised," he said. "I'm not," she said. "Men like Halston don't stay in places where the advantage is gone. There's nothing left for him here." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel anything about it?" She considered the question honestly, the way she always considered honest questions. "I feel that it's over," she said. "That's enough." He nodded and went back to the yard, and she turned back to the stove, and that was all the ceremony. Victor Halston's departure received at Blackthorn Ridge Ranch. The proposal came on a Sunday in October. She had not been expecting Sunday specifically. She had known it was coming, had known since the morning in the kitchen when she had said yes, without using the word, when they had stood in the small space between the stove and the work table, and not needed to say anything more. But Caleb had given her the months, had let the spring and the summer do their work, had not rushed her toward anything she had not already chosen, which was one of the things she understood now as the quality in him that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. He came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning when the house was quiet and the ranch was between its working rhythms, and sat at the end of the work table with his coffee and waited until she turned from the stove, and then he said, "I want to ask you something formally, even though I think we both know the answer. Some things deserve to be asked formally." She wiped her hands on her apron and sat across from him. He asked her. He did not make a speech. He did not recite what she meant to him or enumerate the ways his life had changed, because he was not that kind of man, and she did not need that kind of man. He said simply and directly that he wanted to build the rest of his life at Blackthorn Ridge with her beside him, not as his cook and not as his employee, but as his partner in the full sense of the word, and that he understood what he was asking, and he meant it without condition. She looked at him across the work table, where she had made 1,000 meals and balanced 1,000 accounts and written supply orders and drafted legal letters and taught 17 women how to know what they had and how long it lasted. "Yes," she said. The same word she had said in October on an ordinary morning. She would always say it simply because the simple answer was the true one. He reached across the work table and took her hand, and they sat like that for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and outside the ranch was beginning its day, and the shelf above the work table held everything she had put on it, and the stove held its reliable warmth, and Blackthorn Ridge held them both. They were married in the Millhaven church in November. On the 1-year anniversary of the day, Rosalie had stood at the Halverson door and heard a woman's voice through the wood saying, "Don't open it." I saw her face. She had not chosen the date deliberately. She had not known the date until she counted back the weeks after Caleb suggested November, and then she had sat with it for a day and decided that it was not irony and it was not defiance. It was just time moving forward, which was what time always did, indifferent to closed doors and open ones alike. And the only thing a person could do with it was decide what to build in the space it gave them. Doris Calloway stood in the front row and cried, which surprised everyone who knew Doris Calloway. Thomas stood beside Caleb and held the rings with the focused seriousness of a young man who understood that he had been given an important task and was not going to be the reason anything went wrong. Mrs. Frayne sat in the third row with both her sons and her worn notebook in her lap, which she had brought out of habit, and which Rosalie noticed and thought was one of the most unexpectedly perfect things she had ever seen at a ceremony. Pastor Wells performed the service and said at the end of it that he had been a pastor in this county for 20 years and had presided over many marriages, and that the only qualification for a good marriage he had ever found that was both necessary and sufficient was that two people see each other clearly and choose each other anyway, and that by his observation this particular marriage met that qualification without reservation. Rosalie stood at the front of the church in Millhaven, Montana, in November 1887, in the same town where 41 families had found a reason to say no to her, where a man had used a church hall to say her face was evidence of her character, where a newspaper had printed a 7-year-old accusation on page 4. And she stood there with her spine straight and her chin level and the wine-colored birthmark on the left side of her face in full light, and she looked at the man beside her, who had come to a door without his hat, and said, "Can you help me save this place?" And she thought, this is what it looks like when the answer is yes. Not the absence of difficulty, not the erasure of every closed door, not a world that had decided to see her differently because she had earned its approval. Something more honest than any of that. A place she had built with her hands and her mind, and her refusal to disappear. A place where the shelf was full and the accounts were clean, and 17 women came on Saturdays to learn what she knew, and where the man who had asked her to stay had meant it without condition from the first morning to this one. The woman nobody wanted had not waited to be wanted. She had walked through the 42nd door and filled every shelf she found on the other side of it, and she had built something from the ground up in the way that the only real things are built, which is without guarantee, and without permission, and without any assurance, except your own refusal to agree with the people who told you it couldn't be done. And Rosalie Everhart. Rosalie Whitlock, now carrying both names, the way you carry everything that made you who you are, was still there. She had always been going to be still there. That was never really in question.